All right. To those viewing this, thanks so much for coming to this panel on LGBTQ philanthropy. My name is Robin Dembroff, and I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at Yale University. And I'm very excited to be joined by our three panelists who have a lot of extensive experience in this area. So I'll let them speak more to their own experience rather than me trying to rehearse it all for you. But I just want to quickly introduce the three of you. So first, we have Sam Brinton, who is the Vice President of Advocacy and Government Affairs at the Trevor Project, which is an organization that provides crisis intervention for LGBTQ youth. We have second, who is the Senior Communications Officer at the Gill Foundation, which is an organization that funds LGBTQ nonprofits across the country. I wonder how many times I can say LGBTQ without it becoming like a one just sound coming out of my mouth. And then lastly, we have Rick Chavez Zber. Did I say that correctly? Great. Who is a former partner at Latham and Watkins and is the current executive director of Equality California, which is the largest statewide LGBTQ organization. So first, I just want to do 2 points of housekeeping before I jump into questions. So the first thing is that I know sometimes on these panels, people will ask a question and they'll go in order and have each person answer it. I'd rather encourage something more like natural dialogue between the four of us. So instead of doing that, I'm going to throw out a question and then just open the floor for kind of general dialogue between the panelists. And then lastly, for the audience, if you have any questions for any of the panelists, please go ahead and put those in the chat. And I will be asking some of those questions closer to the end of the panel. Okay, so first I want to kind of ask an orienting question just to kind of get a sense of where you see queer philanthropy as being in our current context, what are the main challenges and so on. So for some context, when I was thinking about this and thinking about the current moment for queer communities in the US, it seems like it's a very complex moment in a lot of ways. So on the one hand, we have this new White House, thank God, which has reinstated federal protections for queer people. We also have the recent Supreme Court decision in Bostock, which extended Title VII protections in the workplace to include gay and trans people. But on the other hand, we have a new far-right Supreme Court, in my opinion, and also growing antagonism towards particularly transgender and gender non-conforming persons among right-wing politicians and population. So in light of this, I'm wondering what you all think are the most immediate or pressing issues for LGBTQ persons in the US today, and what strategies you think that queer philanthropy organizations should employ to address those issues.
I'll start if you'd like. So obviously we're at a period of incredible opportunity with the new administration coming in. I think we have very high degree of confidence, and some of this has already occurred of, rolling back some of these really horrible and harmful executive decisions, including, the bans on transgender people from serving in the military to sort of the attack on LGBTQ healthcare, and all of the things that were affecting students, and we've got a real opportunity to pass the Equality Act, which is would provide federal LGBTQ plus civil rights protections across the country for the first time in history. Obviously, there's some big questions about that in terms of whether or not we can get that passed in the Senate and what happens with the dynamics of removal of the filibuster, which seems like it would be required to get that passed in this cycle. But we're optimistic that will happen, and we at least have that opportunity out there. I think for your question focused on the court, there's a lot of things we can do without having to risk things in the court. But I will say we are actually in California being very careful about advancing things that could go to the court under this conservative court and could result in bad jurisprudence. And so our community has pulled back on advancing some things in the conversion therapy area because of the risks of bad court decisions. In California, we're dealing with, and I know Sam knows a lot about this, but we're dealing with increasing issues related to the provision of healthcare by medical providers that impose religious restrictions on the care that they can provide. And some of our responses to that, in fact, there's a matter pending with a contract that would allow, at the California universities, would allow provision of healthcare by Dignity Health, which actually imposes these religious restrictions. And we have a lot of concerns about the impact on reproductive care and LGBTQ and trans care at these. And so we're having to think carefully about how we deal with those things so that we actually create responses that are not focused on the religious institutions and doesn't create bad jurisprudence. And then I think the last thing I'll say, and then I'll go to someone else, is I think the risks are, with the rise of QAnon, the risks are arising more at the local level. We're seeing even in, a deep blue state in California, that we've got our opponents are organizing at school districts across the state, really trying to get school districts to not implement the laws that we've passed, and trying to actually get school districts to roll back. We actually have school board members in school districts in Orange County that were in Washington, D.C. on January 6th and participating in the insurrection. And so a big focus of ours, and I know Sam will probably want to talk about some of this as well, but a big focus of ours is really what we need to do in the schools. I always say our schools are really the focal point for the LGBTQ movement now. That's where our opponents view a weakness and are looking at putting wedges between us and our progressive partners. And we need to pay attention to it and start focusing on the inroads they're trying to make to defeat some of the goals that we have as a community. So let me stop there and let some others respond.
I really appreciate that. Michael, do you mind if I go next, or you want to, all you? Okay, so good, no problem. So building off of what Rick said, I think it is so abundantly clear that the other side has learned if they cannot win in the matter of public opinion, they will target the most vulnerable. It is just so clear that there is no more grace or I would call, like humility or any type of those spaces among our opponents, because they're attacking trans youth. Like there is so adamantly those who cannot defend themselves at this point that it's really, really quite painful. I think there is, yes, in terms of legal victories, we've had really good moments as a national org. I can't tell you how many 14-hour days I'm pulling at this point now because of how many bad bills are dropping so fast and moving. They're having hearings on MLK Day. They're just so obliterating any type of process because they know if they overwhelm us, one of them will get through. I bring up Idaho. Last year, as the pandemic was starting, was the only one to pass one of these really anti-trans bills. And yes, we're fighting it in the courts, but we're now back in the place of, despite a pandemic happening, I think there are now over 300 bad bills that have happened since marriage equality that we're currently, in the midst of fighting. They are fine-tuning based on the number of states that they can hit. We're noticing that with each state, the legal argument that works in one is immediately being addressed and then copied into a next. I don't mean to make it negative, but it has definitely been one of those seasons of, with great power comes great responsibility. Like with great administrative support from the federal agencies, we're now just taking all of that pressure onto the state level. It's as if all of it moves down. Very much in alignment with Rick. Very nervous about the current court. We have been trying to defend conversion therapy laws now for quite a while. I think it's important to, since you're those of you who are watching, to know that we are not always winning. The most clear example of this is the 11th Circuit when it comes to conversion therapy. It's an outlier, but all other federal appeals courts have said that the protections of these conversion therapy laws are able to be maintained. And again, they're bipartisan. These are bipartisan laws that are passing with tons of really great support because you shouldn't hurt kids. Pretty simple premise here, but they're still in court being said, well, we're getting in the way of a parent or a professional from doing their job. And at the same exact time, they're telling us professionals should not be able to do, or parents should not be able to intervene and actually support a trans young person's ability. Like, it's choose your own adventure in the adventures of evil, is kind of how I'm putting it at this point. And right now, we're having to read a lot of books at the same time. So when it comes to legal court, I think one of our major strategies has got to be talk about the harm. That's where Trevor Project has been so, I'm not to toot our own horn, but like powerful, is that because when you're calling the Trevor Project, you're probably not calling us because you're having a really great day. You're in general calling us because of a harm that's happened to you, and then you are now holding that mental health harm. So our amicus briefs in the trans military ban, in the conversion therapy laws, in these awful trans sports and trans medical care bills, right, have all concentrated on harm. So when we think about legal victories, I think that is going to be one of the ways that we're going to be able to deal with the current court. I am no lawyer. That's where I leave it to my friend Rick. But as a person who can make people cry, I think that's my job right now, is just to make sure people understand how bad this is harm-wise, and to get away from some of these First Amendment questions, these like rights of refusal questions. They're a mess. And they're not going to really, I think, go in our favor very much until we can start to directly tie them to the harm. So more research and talking points that tie this to harm will be how I think we get out of the legal court's mess. That's my perspective on it.
Yeah, and I'll bring us up for a second and then bring us back down. We'll roller coaster this today, but I mean, we do see great opportunity out there with the federal administration that we have. We've already seen some wins just in the first week of the new administration. We saw wins, but on the flip side of that, with that opportunity comes many pitfalls, traps that the opposition are laying in the states and at the federal level. For one example, with the executive order that President Biden implemented on his first day, the Bostock executive order to extend employment protections across the federal government and its agencies. There's a Media Matters report that I can try to find and share with folks, but Fox News and its affiliates characterized that executive order solely as a trans athletes, trans sports participation executive order. And so, with greater representation and with the victories also comes more misinformation, and we have to make sure that we're taking that into account. As Rick was saying, misinformation, that's sort of a new area of funding that we're looking at here at the foundation, because it is so incredibly rampant at the local level, and social media, and like we're trying to figure out, well, how do we deal with platforms versus how do we deal with public opinion? It's a messy field that we're working with misinformation. On the legal front, I'll just add, we definitely see, it's been refreshing to hear grantees for the first time in a long time, just kind of breathe out for a second and say, oh, we have proactive opportunities now. We're not on defense every day. We're not waking up every day checking Twitter and seeing what the next bad thing is. That's not that those things aren't happening. And as Sam said, in the States, it's a pretty bad place to be right now with the coordination that's happening from our opponents. But it has been refreshing to be proactive. But with that, we also have to put in safeguards, legal safeguards, making sure we're crafting policy to account for the rightward lean, the increasingly rightward lean of the federal judiciary. And so while Bostock was great, it was a 6-3 opinion. I do want to note that by a Trump appointee, the court has become more conservative since, as we all watched in horror, probably in the fall. And so we do have to make sure that we are accounting for that. I don't want to write off the court, but I think our legal arguments have to shift a little bit. We have to be savvy with how we present our issues.
Thanks. I want to pick up on the thread, especially that Sam and Michael raised about these anti-trans bills, especially those targeting trans youth in sports and trans women in sports, especially, et cetera. So one question I had for you all, because this is something that is popping up a lot in my own field of philosophy and is certainly popping up at the level of political activism and pushing for anti-trans laws and so on, is seeing a lot of the organizations that are attempting to undermine trans rights doing so in the name of feminism and presenting themselves as feminist organizations that are pushing for this. And so, I mean, historically, right, there have been a lot of important points of solidarity between queer organizations and feminist organizations. So I'm wondering how you all think about this rise of anti-trans so-called feminism in how it's affecting these policies and laws being passed. So what, especially with respect to messaging, and maybe Michael, you can pick up on this, what kind of messaging do you think that queer organizations should adopt in order to address this new line of messaging that says trans rights are at odds with women's rights, and so you have to choose whether you're going to be a trans ally or a feminist?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's difficult. The opposition has identified an issue that that is designed exclusively to drive a wedge between the feminist movement, the women's rights movement, and the LGBTQ rights movement, which makes it difficult. You know, there are we have a lot of allies, and we have for decades been in lockstep in one way or another with the women's rights and feminist rights movement. And so that's the good, I think that's the good news, is that we do have quite a bit of allyship. But you start, like, the more this messaging gets out there and the more coordinated it is from the opposition, the more you're seeing some of the cracks start to appear between the movements. And that is really concerning. I think one thing that, and this kind of gets back to misinformation, you know, it's sometimes, and when we have to address, I don't want to make it seem like I'm saying we shouldn't address trans participation in sport at all. We have to address it. We have to figure out as a movement what our messaging, what our policy is on that, that is affirming and that is inclusive. But at the same time, you know, one of the best ways that we can fight some of this misinformation and such is to expose it. To expose it as coordinated. It's no mistake that you get this women's policy working group announced last week. I think it was last Wednesday. And then on Friday or Monday, you get an op-ed from Nikki Haley coming out about this. And it's just a drip, drip, drip. And then I believe as soon as the Equality Act is introduced in the House, it's just going to be a tsunami of anti-trans, especially as it relates to sports participation, information from the opposition. So, you know, one thing that we're trying to determine right now as it relates to messaging is how do we expose these folks? These folks have never been proponents of women's rights. They've never been feminists. Like it's the Heritage Foundation folks. Like they've never been on the side of women and women's rights. And now all of a sudden, now that they see a way to sort of connect themselves to that, to hurt our cause, they're going to do that. So we need to be effective in exposing that. And, you know, I mean, these are the same people. I think I saw a social media post the other day where someone was saying, you know, these folks, I don't want to speak for the opponents, but you can assume these folks are probably folks who never really cared much about women's sports to begin with. These are organizations that just don't see much value in that, but they see an opportunity and they're exploiting it. So, you know, it's hard. I don't have a clear answer yet, but we're working on it. We're trying to figure out how to expose and also how to work on policy that's inclusive for transgender youth.
I love that, Michael. I think I will say something potentially divisive because that's Sam here, which is they found a crack because we didn't have the foundation built. There is so clearly a space of the movement was trying to figure out what to do about sports is a very large and open question. I can agree with that. In Rick's world, there's even in California, there's even the chance of like, what do we do about those of us who are like me, right, who are non-binary. Like I played sports in high school, and that was a traumatic experience. But like it worked for me. But we could now live in a world where you may not have to have these types of same challenges, but we're not even close to non-binary sports participation right now. We're trying to figure out some of the basics, how to build this foundation now that the house is already under attack. So I think one of the reason I mentioned this is kind of divisive is we don't have a lot of pragmatic, moderate space. I come from a world of, let me hear both sides and try to find where there is overlap that will save lives, right? Like that's kind of my MO. And right now, both camps have kind of built in this like strong aversion to each other. And I'm sitting here going like, the LGBT movement did not have a predisposition on how this was all going to go. I see it in the comments, the TERFs have kind of figured out that they can attack this, but we don't have direct messaging in response to them because they're working with our allies. So you can't actually just do a full out spread. So I don't mean to make this all negative again, because now it's what it's sounding like. But I think that part of this is something that we need philanthropy and others to support some of these issues way before they get to this point, right? Like we should have had a lot of 2 years ago, if we wouldn't have been under attack from an administration, we would have had time to really, as a community, sit down and say, with philanthropy support, let's figure out what we can give and what we can't give up on these types of issues, and where we can, in support, have proactive legislation. This is, I will make one connection that is out there, which is we are currently facing 6 pro-conversion therapy laws this year. Now, the only reason we're able to fight that many pro-conversion therapy laws is because we have 20 anti-conversion therapy laws already in place that are doing the good work of kind of proving the issue is already settled, right? We can kind of, whenever they try to bring this up, we can be like, you're fighting an old battle. We've already figured this out. We didn't have that. We didn't have 20 states that had pro-trans sports participation codified. And because of it, we're now trying to do catch up. I'm not saying this to attack my movement. I'm saying this as we now need to be figuring out what their issue is going to be in 2 years so we can have those laws in place before they get that bad. So what do you think, Rick? Was I totally wrong there? I don't know.
No. I mean, I think one of the threads that I think we're facing even here in California is the fact that our opponents are trying to drive wedges between our community and our historic partners, progressive partners. And a good example of that was our SB 145, which was a bill that was really trying to take the vestiges out of the sodomy laws out of California's sex offender registry. And our opponents were, this became a QAnon focused issue. Our opponents focused on folks that that represented religious communities and basically used all the homophobic and transphobic tropes that you would expect. And I got to say, it almost worked. Even in California, we got that bill passed by the bare minimum of votes that our opponents then used the votes from the folks that voted for it in campaigns across the state. It became an issue in the San Diego mayor's race against Todd Gloria, who was the first gay mayor of the city of San Diego. But we were on defense really the entire time after that, and that's an example of what we're sort of seeing across even in a state like California. They are realizing that their way of succeeding is to drive wedges between our community and basically our progressive partners, and using children as the main messaging point, that we're somehow a threat to children, that somehow we're predators, that they need to stand up for. We had legislators who have been Democrats say, I look at this as a mom, and I would sit there and think, I'm a parent too. Obviously, this is about, do you care as much about your trans and our LGBTQ kids as you care about all kids? This is not about that. But anyway, I think that the wedge strategy is something we're seeing across the country, and I think it's something we need to see more of. And I think in terms of philanthropy, we need to start, I think, funding some of the stuff that we need to do at the local level. I mean, a big priority for us is really, we've got sort of student groups and parent groups in all these Orange County and Antelope County school districts, which come to us, and we just don't have the capacity to help them very much. But they'll show up to a school board meeting, and there's 1,000 people organized by the right, basically complaining about either the sex ed curriculum or some progressive law that we passed that needs to be implemented. And then we've got, a handful of LGBTQ kids with no support, and the other side has organizers in all of these districts. And so that's something that we need to sort of figure out how we respond to.
Yeah, when I think about these, as you called them, wedge strategies and the attempts to separate our community from other communities, it raises another question that I had for y'all, which is about the delineation of what our community is. So I take it that one of the main strategies, these wedge strategies, really rely on people not having an intersectional analysis of what queerness is and what the boundaries of a queer community is. And that seems like an issue that I'm sure is really live for queer philanthropy. So like, what counts as queer issues? Who counts as the queer community? So I'm wondering how you all think about that. So how do you think about the boundaries of what counts as a queer issue, that are the issues that are relevant for queer philanthropy, particularly given the growing awareness at one level, but also continuing lack of awareness at another of the intersectional relationships between sex and gender on the one hand, but then also race and class and disability and incarceration, immigration, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we actually have a very intersectional focus. It's it's embedded in our mission. I think we were one of the organizations that moved strongly in that direction when I came on board. We were just coming out of the marriage equality fight, and I think a lot of folks thought of LGBTQ civil rights as really just that narrow, as marriage and the narrow package of civil rights protections. I mean, what we know is that civil rights protections are not alone going to provide people with what we would call full lived equality. So, our focus is really in California has shifted to how do we address all the disparities in health and well-being that the LGBTQ community faces. If you look at, everything from dropout rates in the schools to rates of homelessness, where 4 out of 10 homeless youth are members of the LGBTQ plus community, to rates of interaction with the criminal justice system, convictions, conviction on arrest, healthcare coverage, economic status, rates of smoking and substance use. On almost every measure of community health, LGBTQ people score poorly. And if you have another identity that is also subject to lack of acceptance, if you're a member of a community of color, if you're an immigrant, if you're a person living with HIV, and if you're a woman, frankly, you are at the bottom of every one of those measures. And so for us, we always talk about being the voice and bringing the voice of our community and our allies to institutions of power. And it's to create a world that is fully equal, not only for LGBTQ people, but the vulnerable communities that we're a part of. So we know that we have to have that kind of focus. And so it does mean that we have a broader focus. It means that we're key partners, part of the civil rights movement. We're a key partner with the labor unions, making sure that we basically are addressing economic status. And then I'll talk about this a little bit later. I really do think that, as I think I mentioned before, our key focus has to be the schools right now. Schools, both because our opponents are there, but because it is the key intervention to achieving full lived equality. If you think about it, we know what's happening. We've got kids that are being bullied in school and are not being provided support, or they're being bullied or they're facing lack of acceptance in their community or in their own home. And the main intervention, I mean, we know, and I think the Trevor Project is the source of some of this data. We know that these kids, when they're facing these circumstances, the main places they're going to go is to a teacher or a school counselor. Yes. And we know that school districts across the state, there's in California, in almost no state, there's no cultural counseling training for teachers. There's very few best practices in place. I mean, we have a safe and supportive schools initiative where we're evaluating all the school districts in the state in terms of trying to put the spotlight on them and incentivize them to have best practices. But we need to, if we're going to address those health and welfare disparity, health and well-being disparities, we need to make sure that we keep kids in school and keep them from becoming homeless and all of the things that result from that, turning to things that are illegal, survival sex, and issues with respect to substance to support themselves, and then an interaction with the criminal justice system, and a whole cycle. So anyway, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think that the schools, frankly, is a really important place. That's another reason why I think the work of Trevor is so important, frankly, and many of our colleagues. But we're thinking through a new messaging strategy as we move ahead, which is, the schools are the key to achieving LGBTQ civil rights. I mean, that is the main intervention. If we can get it right in the schools and start putting more resources there, I think we have a big opportunity to really change the lives of LGBTQ people and change this whole cycle and trajectory.
Okay, Michael, I apologize. I'm just definitely gonna jump into that one because take me to church moment. That was exactly it, Rick. I think intersectionality starts at the most, hopefully, intersectional part of our lives, which is when we are in school, when we have the great equalizer of learning together. That is the best opportunity for us to start to address some of these problems. I cannot agree more. We worked with Equality California to pass a law so that every single school in California has a suicide prevention policy. Why? Because it doesn't matter if you're LGBTQ. If you are LGBTQ, if you're living in rural locations, if you're socioeconomically depressed, if you are homeless, if you have veterans in your family, these are all intersections that could be LGBTQ, but that you are higher risk of suicide. And we knew, get a policy in place. It won't just help the LGBT kids. It will help everyone. And that's actually what we should all be doing because we're more than just our sexual and gender identities, right? So could not agree more with that. I'll jump into another intersectional space, which is so niche that if any philanthropy ever wants to talk about this, I will talk your head off about it, which is death data. We are dying, but no one knows that we're dying until finally we're working with Equality California again, because when in doubt, go to California. You're working with Equality California again to the first national bill in history, which will say when we die, you need to ask about our gender identity and our sexual orientation. Why? Because intersectionally, trans women of color are dying, but we don't know how many because we're not asking the question. And when you're just another homeless person who dies, the lack of intersection is actually part of the challenge that is killing us. So you want a new, fresh idea on how to be intersectional? Capture our data. It's not just about sexual orientation and gender identity. It's about making sure that I'm getting preachy. I apologize. I'm realizing my voice is up. This is a thing I care about, which is I'm tired of us saying that if you're not marching in a pride parade, you're not part of our community. That is not true. The trans woman of color who is using survival sex is living the life that they are currently living because we're not getting the data to say they deserve better socioeconomic conditions to be able, minimum wage, to be able to do the things that we want them to be able to live happy and productive lives. How do we get that all started? It's again, schools, right back to where Rick was, which is making sure that a person has the opportunity to, as California has been trying to pass for a while, have cultural competency actually in your school, teach history, LGBT history, finally got that through, way to go, Rick, right? And have suicide prevention and mental health policies that are inclusive, right? This is, you talk about intersectional. I'll give one last example because it's a powerful positive and I've been too negative. So here's your major positive here. Your powerful intersectional positive is the very first pro-LGBT bill in history to pass unanimously this year, the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act. It is the first bill ever to include the words LGBT and not have a single person vote against it. Why? Because it was built on the idea of intersectionality, that we said high-risk populations, yes, do include LGBT, but they also include rural individuals, they include veterans, that when we are talking about mental health, Mental health is the great equalizer, and you are not going to have just one part of your identity be the sole defining part of it. And that unanimous vote, while it did get me in a lot of trouble with, let's be very clear, some of the LGBT orgs in the world, which were like, we do not want to give them a win. I'm sorry, but saving lives is a win regardless of which party gets to be the co-authors on it. So I say that true intersectional work is about addressing the most fundamental, the school, the mental health, the healthcare access. These are things that do not rely on our identities to be a win or a victory, and are proven to get a unanimous vote. So you cannot tell me that the week, last bit, and then I'll turn it over to Michael. Sorry, get here in this moment. Wait, that bill passed unanimously the week after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The world was literally at the most fiery on its moment, and it still passed a bill unanimously through because it was intersectional, and we didn't have to use the word intersectional to do it. We used the words that they understood that would actually be a variety of populations that they cared about, and made sure that all populations were actually included in the space. So anyway, I will get off that high horse, but if you want a truly successful moment of intersectionality, it's the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act, which again, we're glad to work with Equality California and others on, because it was a great moment for the world actually saying we may be the most divided possible, but we understand that we have to serve all. That has to actually be a thing. And when we're not talking about marriage, and when we're not talking about these other issues, you could get past it to true intersectionality. Okay, stop. Sorry about there.
Yeah, no, I mean, and Sam, I think that my former senator here in Colorado, who's a Republican, was the main Republican co-sponsor in the Senate on that bill. We promptly voted him out.
He did.
We were very happy that he did that. But I think that's important to note. Like, you can disagree on so many things, but if you craft the policy and in a way that is truly intersectional, in a way that everyone can understand, then you get more people at the table than you could have ever imagined. I'll pick up on data, how important that is. I'll give a shout out to a grantee of ours, another great organization from the state of California, the Williams Institute at UCLA, who are really doing some groundbreaking research on the intersection of LGBTQ, racial and economic justice. I mean, they're just, if you're on their listserv, if you're not, I would get on their listserv, because they put out research quite often, and they are just, pumping out the research in this regard. And it's really good. It's academically rigorous research. They are an amazing team there at UCLA in the law school there. So I would definitely give a plug for them. And they've always been huge advocates of more data. I mean, their work depends on us collecting data on LGBTQ people. The only other thing I'll say in this regard is with our highly polarized environment that we live in, it is so easy for people to outgroup us, and we have to resist that. We have to talk about and show our intersectionality so that people understand that we're not to be just put in a box by ourselves. Like, you can't just outgroup us, because we're your neighbors, we're your friends, we're your family. It is important to do that. We're your kids' friends and stuff like that. If we're talking about kind of going back to school, like understanding that your kids' friends, if you have kids, many of them are of the LGBTQ community, and so there's a lot of intersections there. One way to do that is through local storytelling, making sure that we are lifting up the stories of LGBTQ people who are leaders in their community, who are contributing to their community in all different kinds of ways. Like Sam said, we're more than just our sexual orientation or gender identity. We have all these different let's stack our identities. Let's show that we are all of these other things. And it's one reason why at the foundation, we've always been proud to work with we call them unlikely allies, folks that you wouldn't normally think would be with us, but we can really pull them along in our favor. One is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. We've worked with them for years now, and we're really proud of the work we've done to get the business community to sort of inch forward little by little but inch forward on our issues and understand that your employees are LGBTQ, your employees' kids are LGBTQ. And so anyway, there's a lot of ways that we can technically demonstrate that intersectionality.
Yeah, so since y'all emphasize data so much, I want to ask a little bit more about that. Because at least in the circles I run in, there's a lot of, I think, reasonable skepticism about the gathering of data about queer communities and who's the one gathering the data, how is it gathered, who is it being used to serve? Is it being controlled by the state? Do we trust the state to have that kind of data? How can it be used badly, et cetera? So when you talk about data being so important to gather, what are your thoughts on how to go about gathering such data responsibly?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's been a high priority to pass laws that require voluntary gathering of what's called SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity data, from government agencies are collecting data. So our view is anytime demographic data is being collected, if you're collecting it on race and gender and other issues, they should be collecting it on sexual orientation and gender identity, at least on a voluntary, as in other factors, on a voluntary basis. And it is really important because we don't know whether we're being served by the programs that are serving the general public if we're not gathering that data. I mean, a clear example, we actually had an emergency bill this year when we realized that at the COVID testing sites throughout the state of California, they were not asking sexual orientation and gender identity data. So we had no idea the extent to which LGBTQ plus people were contracting COVID. And we, based on Williams Institute data and others, believed, and I think it's showing some of the work that Williams Institute has been doing even since the beginning of the pandemic is showing that our what we expected is actually probably true, meaning that LGBTQ people, because we work in frontline jobs and in the gig economy at a much greater percentage than the general public, we're more likely to contract COVID than others, and then our community, because we have so many comorbidities, high rates of HIV, certain health conditions, higher rates of smoking, that folks in our community, when they contract it, are more likely to have adverse health impacts. And obviously, we still don't have that right. They're still not collecting the data, and we know if we're not part of the data, that we're not part of the health response. So, we do get on occasion folks that are progressive partners, basically, and this has been expressed to me even from gay folks saying, look at what, isn't it bad to collect data on SOGI data on the LGBTQ community because it could be used against us? And isn't it, and I think it's sort of folks from a different era, isn't it, disrespectful to ask that personal data? Our view is that, when this data, especially in the health context and others, it's aggregated. There are provisions in place that apply to the other collection of democratic data that are in place that provide individual protections. And so I think, we and almost every LGBTQ plus organization that's involved in advocacy at almost every state level and at the national level are proponents of the voluntary collection of SOGI data whenever demographic data is being collected under any government program.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify the question, I agree with you that this worry about individual privacy is definitely out there, but the worry that I was trying to hone in on more is one about the control of populations. And I think even saying that it's similar to, say, racial demographic data, I mean, I think people of color well know that the gathering of population level data about their communities has been used to police and harm them in pretty extreme ways. So I'm wondering how much those kinds of concerns also translate over into this context.
They definitely transfer, and at the same time, I think I say another potentially divisive moment, which is I feel like the perfect is becoming the enemy of the good when those kinds of moments come forward, which is right now we don't have almost any data. Williams is trying to pull things from the least amount of opportunities, and there's little that we know. I agree with the point of, and we have gotten it many a time, that we've been told to back off because this data could fall into the wrong hands. And I understand that fear. I think there is a lack of understanding, however, of the abstraction. That population level data is just that. I think there have been moments that data has been used inappropriately, but much of the data that we are working with at this point is extremely difficult to actually tie back to an individual. I think of, first off, in the sense of death data. Now that's a hard one. You pointed out, which is most of the time, and this is where there's not a wedge between Equality California and Trevor, not even remotely. But like, one of our challenges is that in California, the data is more accessible, and nationally, the data is not very accessible. And so I have to figure out a way to tailor talking points to a California context of, this is voluntary data that we will never get all the way right, but at least it will get us closer to than we are right now with nothing, right? Like, if we can limit the number of unknowns, that gets us a slightly better public health solution than just cross the board activities. So I would say we as the LGBT movement have to prioritize privacy. We need to recognize the risk and not try to just override it with we need this data in order to make it happen. But at the same time, we need to have very clear responses of what data can actually be used for. I think we are living in a generation and in an age where data has the power to save a lot more lives than it used to, especially because of how much data is out there now. But that the communication around that has been, all of your data is being stolen by mega companies who are going to try to sell you a watch, right? Like, that is the current world debate. And so having clear and present education and public health education, which could again be funded by philanthropies, to help LGBTQ communities understand why the Williams data matters, Williams Institute data matters, why we need to collect some of this, not because it's going to put you on a list, but instead because it's going to help save the next life. It's not maybe about your current experience that is going to be about it. You have to be a little bit selfless and know that the next generation are actually where we're trying to do this. I think of that because I'm thinking with kids all the time, but we now see this, right? I got to be on a call yesterday with CDC where they knew my question. There was a new survey that was going out in the middle of COVID to schools, and I said, is sexual orientation and gender identity asked on it? Because if it's not, there's zero reason you shouldn't be doing it. There's absolutely no reason you shouldn't be asking this question. And they did. They said, yes, the question is on there for a young person to choose whether they want to or not. When we get that data back, it's going to show what we all know. LGBTQ youth are expanding as a community. It's just the best way of saying it, right? We know more about them than we have ever known before. And they are okay with us knowing that because they know that means that public health responses will take their needs into consideration.
Yeah, and I'll just pick up quickly. Sam brought up big data and how companies are using that, and that really has sown a lot of distrust among them about the value of data, and rightfully so. I mean, those companies are taking. I think that's one area that really needs a lot of work, and as it intersects with LGBTQ people and youth in particular, is on social media, making sure that platforms are keeping their platforms, their users safe for LGBTQ youth in particular. And it's a big issue, and it sows a lot of distrust. That's something that is sort of part of the misinformation work that we're starting to do, where we're trying to figure out how do you pressure platforms to make their platforms safer and to not use data from LGBTQ youth, because a lot of times that's the only space that LGBTQ youth sometimes feel safe. And then if you then exploit that space, that's a huge problem. And one other thing I'll say is that not only do we have issues with data collection, we have a huge gap in longitudinal data about LGBTQ people because we have forever not collected that data. And so, California, I'm just going to, Pride study out of Stanford, it's doing some really, really good work, a longitudinal health study on LGBTQ populations, and I just want to give them a shout out to in the research that they're doing, because it's one of the I think it is the first longitudinal health study of LGBTQ people that is voluntary, and that also is tracking over several years' time. So anyway, just another shout out.
If I could just something really, really short before your next question, Robin, and that's really about picking up on something that Michael mentioned, and that is that, you know, when we're talking about data collection from government agencies, there are a whole host of protections, and Sam alluded to this, that are already in place, particularly in the health space, but even in employment and the other areas. The areas where we're seeking to have more data collection, you know, it's aggregated, personal privacy issues are generally dealt with, and we're basically being asked to be treated in the same way that other demographic data is changed. That doesn't necessarily, though, obviously, you know, so the risks to people in our community are much lower on this stuff that we're advocating for than the risk that folks already face just by being on social media platforms. I mean, you know, folks can actually go in and look at the, you know, who people like, what kinds of pages, who they follow. I mean, you know, that kind of analysis that's available off of social media platforms has much more risk to sort of, from a privacy perspective, than sort of, you know, the effort to have more data collection from, you know, demographic data collection from government agencies.
Amen.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I appreciate
Robin, one sentence about
you
that.
You have one sentence, Sam. Even
the culmination of that risk is conversion therapy. They are targeting conversion therapy ads to LGBTQ youth. Even though they can't track LGBTQ youth, they can figure out these likes, and we are still to this day fighting ads targeting youth with conversion therapy. So just, there's your challenge. If it's not done by the government, it will be done by our opponents, and they will figure out ways to use that to hurt us. Sorry for the extra sentence.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that really concrete example that illustrates the problem. Yeah. So at risk of asking another question as a final question, that's another, as Sam put it, the perfect is the enemy of the good, but also you entered this panel with a philosopher. So I'm sorry, I'm gonna ask you another philosophical question here. So I'm obviously not coming at this from within the space of philanthropy, but philanthropy, just as a concept, as I understand it, relies on pretty massive wealth inequality, and particularly wealth inequality that's created and reinforced by a capitalist system. Now, on the other hand, I think queer and gender theorists have been saying for many, many years that capitalism and sexism are mutually reinforcing. And I take sexism here to include things like transphobia and homophobia. So I'm wondering if you think that there's a tension, or even to put it stronger, an internal contradiction that comes with using philanthropy as a tool for queer and anti-sexist liberation. And if so, how do you think that queer philanthropic organizations should navigate that tension?
I'll try starting this one.
So brave. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, that's not the easiest question to give it when you have 4 minutes before the end of your presentation, but we'll go with it. I will say the way I have started to approach this has now been through, I'll give it a concrete example, which is our Microgrant program. We recognize that there were 20 states working, I'm going to use again the example of conversion therapy. There were 20 states working to end conversion therapy. There are still another 10 that haven't even submitted their first law trying to work to end conversion therapy. So I tasked myself and my team with the idea of, that's where the resources need to go. That is where the education and time needs to be spent, because yes, we want to win in California. We will keep winning in California, and we need to spend our time there, but we also need to think of Kentucky. We need to think of Alabama. And so one of the ways to address the socioeconomic differences has been, we recognize that a small grant in some of those locations means the world. It's make or break. We put out it was $125,000 in microgrants to groups because we couldn't travel this year. And so we're like, you know what? We had that in our budget. I'm probably giving away way too much information, but like, we had the money. And I said, no, you're not taking away from my budget. You're giving it to those on the ground because I can't be on the ground. So that's, I think, where some of this work needs to be. We need to, as philanthropy, recognize that we come from abundance in some ways, but that abundance is even more strongly emphasized if we can target it to target bad language, if we can use it in places that it can do the most good. So that's my like microgrant example of having philanthropies give more of these types of small individual working with the groups and using state partners like Equality California or Trevor Project as a kind of, yes, I've worked with them before, they will use your money appropriately, right? Can be a really powerful way of making that gap a little bit less pronounced.
Yeah, and I'll tackle this, from the funder's perspective. We are at the Gill Foundation, we're a single funder foundation. That doesn't necessarily insulate us from some of the criticism you're talking about, some of those challenges. But we really have, we're guided by some principles here. One being iteration and experimentation. We have resources. And with that, I think Sam mentioned earlier, with that kind of opportunity comes a lot of responsibility, and we do that seriously. And so, we do a lot of the advances in the LGBTQ movement over the last few decades have been because folks have experimented with different messaging and different tactics and things like that, and we've really figured out through iteration what works best and how we can collectively accomplish our goals. I'll give one quick example also of that responsibility and how we have implemented that. This started back in the early 90s, mid 90s when we first started, and we were mostly focused on Colorado, but we make every grantee show us proof that they have a non-discrimination policy that is inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity. And that has actually, we do that also for employee gift matches, by the way. If philanthropies are looking for a way to really use the leverage that they have, given that they hold resources, that's a good way to do that and really make people think about, oh, why don't we have a policy that's inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity? It worked for a lot of local organizations in Colorado. I just got an organization in Colorado that I had given to add gender identity. They had sexual orientation but not gender identity, to add gender identity to their non-discrimination policy so that it would be matched by my place of employment. So that's just a small way that philanthropy can, and just a small example, but it is a way that we can use the privilege and the power that we have in a responsible way.
Yeah, I guess I'll just close by basically saying that, I think those of us who are on the panel and many of our colleagues, obviously, our goal is actually to make our world, to achieve both equality and social equity and social justice. And I think we're just fortunate that we actually have in the philanthropic community folks that actually share those values. I think, dealing with sort of the power structures that create where we sit today are ones that, to a certain extent, I feel are beyond my pay grade. I think we think about them, but I think it's been heartening to me to sort of see folks like the founder of the Gill Foundation, like Jack Dorsey very recently, really taking large portions of their net worth and really, those that are actually socially progressive, focusing on helping organizations that are advancing equality and social justice, really sort of achieve our mission. So, yeah. Okay.
I appreciate all of those perspectives. And thank you so much for being part of this panel. I wish I could grab a beer with you all after this, but unfortunately, I'll just have to wave to you on a screen.
Until next time. Until the next beer. Until the next one.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you all so much.